We're now joined by Nader Hashemi, who's the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at Denver University in Colorado in the United States. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
So what do we make of these talks? Should people recognize them as significant, or does this perhaps end up as a photo opportunity and not much else?
They're significant, but not significant for those of us in the international community who desperately want to see a just and lasting resolution of the Israel-Palestine conflict. They're significant fundamentally in the following sense. The Palestinian Authority under Mahmoud Abbas is on the verge of collapse. It has long been a deeply corrupt, non-representative, and effectively a collaborationist Palestinian entity that works very closely with Israel to control the Palestinians in the Westbank, to prevent them from organizing and mobilizing against Israeli occupation. Over the last several months, there's been a series of scandals that have rocked the Palestinian Authority. They're suffering financially. They're suffering from lagging internal political legitimacy. So I read this meeting fundamentally as an attempt by Israel to shore up, to rescue, to resuscitate a deeply corrupt and in fact morally bankrupt Palestinian Authority that's on the verge of collapse.
And how does that serve Israel to support Abbas?
Well, Israel doesn't have to do the dirty work. The Palestinian Authority does the dirty work on behalf of Israel in exchange for perks, financial incentives, material rewards. And this was very much, foundational to the creation of the Palestine Authority that goes back to the Oslo Accords, in 1993. And Israeli leaders were very open and honest about what the role of the Palestine Authority will be, after 1993. And they openly said that the role of the Palestine Authority was effectively to control the Palestinian population, to prevent them from organizing and challenging Israel's control over the occupied territories. So that's basically the way it works. Anyone who knows anything about the history of foreign occupations knows that foreign occupations always take place with local collaborators. And so in this case, the local collaborator is the Western-backed Palestine Authority under the control of an 85-year-old dictator known as Mahmoud Abbas.
Hamas and other groups in Gaza are certainly watching this. They're getting support financially from countries like Qatar. So how do you have this meeting between the West Bank's Abbas and Israel and not talk to the other groups in Gaza and hope for anything meaningful?
Well, the position of the, at least Western liberal democracies, is that Hamas is not a partner for peace because it's an organization that uses violence, uses terrorism against Israel. So we can't have any diplomatic engagement with it. It's persona non grata, unlike the Palestine Authority, which can be engaged with because they do not take the positions that Hamas does. But you're absolutely right in terms of your question. If you wanted to look at public opinion, there's a lot of support and sympathy for Hamas among the Palestinians, increasingly after the last conflict in May, because they are deemed by many Palestinians at least to be resisting Israeli occupation, humiliation, denigration, and dispossession of the Palestinians. And I fundamentally also agree that in order for a just settlement of the conflict to take place, you would have to figure out a way of working with Hamas. Hillary Clinton, at the time when she was Secretary of State, said that Hamas has to observe 3 conditions before it can be considered a serious partner for peace. It had to, number 1, recognize the state of Israel, number 2, renounce violence, and number 3, agree to respect previous agreements that had been signed between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I think that's a perfectly acceptable and reasonable framework and set of conditions that should be demanded of Hamas before they can be included in a peace process. I would just add that those same conditions should also be applied to Israel. In other words, Israel should also be required to recognize the existence of a Palestinian state under international law, which they don't. Israel should also be asked to renounce and roll back its violence, which is far greater and much more destructive than the violence that comes from the Palestinian side. And Israel also should be asked to uphold previous agreements that it signed and doesn't respect. But of course, those demands by Western countries, primarily the United States, are only made of the Palestinian side. And that's why many people around the world view the United States not as an honest broker of the Israel-Palestine conflict, but deeply biased toward one side of this conflict, in other words, the Israeli side.
So this coalition inside Israel now that came together just to get rid of the old prime minister, I mean, that was essentially their mission. And no one really gave it a real chance of surviving. I suppose the tests are now coming, aren't they? When you start to deal with issues like Palestine, we're seeing this divide. Is this about security? Is it about economy? Gantz, Neftali Bennett. How do you make the survival of the coalition on an issue like Palestine?
Well, I think on the issue of Palestine and the very fragile and diverse Israeli coalition that is led by Neftali Bennett, I don't think there has been a major shift in terms of policy between Netanyahu and now Neftali Bennett. I think there's broad agreement in terms of how to treat the Palestinians. If anything, Neftali Bennett is more extreme than Netanyahu, at least rhetorically speaking. But you are right to suggest that because the coalition, the Israeli coalition government, is very diverse and includes Israeli Arab parties, left-wing parties, any serious rupture in relations between the Israelis and the Palestinians, another possible, war, acts of violence, attempts by Israel to, dramatically repress Palestinian opposition to Israeli occupation could destroy the coalition, the Israeli coalition, because it's dependent on these, left-wing Israeli Arab parties. So, we're only about 2 months away into the new Israeli government. I think Netanyahu is very much planning and hoping there will be some sort of Israeli crisis that will force another election, allowing him to, rise to the top of Israeli politics once again.
So, what's his name? Hazem Qassem says that this meeting will deepen the Palestinian division and complicate the Palestinian situation. He's the spokesperson, of course, of Hamas. There is this division: Westbank, Gaza, Hamas, the Palestinian Authority. Is this going to make things worse, deepen the division? What's your take?
Well, you're right. The division is vast, it's deep, it's going stronger. And I really don't see any opportunity or possibility of the Palestine national movement, whether it's, the Palestine Authority in Ramallah or Hamas in Gaza, coming to an agreement where they can unite and mobilize to resist Israeli occupation and to fight for Palestinian national rights. That's primarily because, in my reading, the very nature of the Palestine Authority is dependent on security cooperation from Israel, financial support from Israel and the international community, primarily the West. It has no incentive to agree to share power or even to hold elections. I mean, one of the issues right now that has, led to this, crisis of existence for the Palestine Authority in Ramallah was their decision back in May to delay elections in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and in Gaza, knowing that they would lose those elections. So this speaks to, I think, a bigger problem. I think one of the biggest challenges facing the Palestinians, in my view, I think it's the absolute most important issue for the Palestinian national movement, is they need a new leadership. They need a new leadership that's more representative, that's more accountable, and critically is incorruptible, is not willing to sell out to Israel or the West or to local Arab Gulf tyrannies. That's really willing to, mobilize the international community and to lead the Palestinian national movement in ways that the African National Congress was able to mobilize South Africans, throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s toward national liberation. I'm of the view that unless there is a new Palestinian leadership that sort of goes beyond the current Palestine Authority and Hamas perhaps incorporates more responsible and less corrupt elements from both of these groups and can, manifest itself in some sort of new fashion to lead the Palestinian movements, there's going to be no just resolution of this conflict. There'll just be more of the same, more occupation, more death, more destruction, more instability. That's, I think, the fundamental challenge facing the Palestinian people at this moment.
You were saying earlier that much of what's going on now, for Abbas in particular, is just survival, actually. But there were some demands put on the table. They talked about Israel ending military operations in occupied Westbank, allowing the unification of families with relatives inside Israel, and allowing more Palestinians to work inside Israel. What are the chances he'll get some wins there?
I think there'll be some movement in that direction because doing so will give the Palestine Authority, which is in dire straits at this moment, some breathing room. In other words, if Palestinians are allowed, some of them are allowed to work in Israel, that will help the Palestine economy. If Israel agrees to sort of be less punitive in terms of how it cracks down on Palestinian resistance in the West Bank, that will, ease tensions. We shouldn't forget that since the last Israel-Gaza war in May, 40 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank by Israeli security forces. And of course, the Palestine Authority has been unable and unwilling to, do anything about that. So that just undermines the legitimacy of the Palestine Authority, which is supposed to represent Palestinian interests. So if Israel agrees to take a step back in terms of its repression, that will sort of allow for some breathing room. Fundamentally, I think what the Palestine Authority is hoping for is more cash infusions from outside of Palestine, from Israel, from the West, so it can pay off its supporters to allow it to continue for another day. So I think that's fundamentally what this meeting between the Israeli Defense Minister and Mahmoud Abbas was all about. It's an attempt to rescue and resuscitate a deeply corrupt, a deeply bankrupt political entity known as the Palestine Authority.
So do countries like the US recognize that this Palestinian Authority is problematic because of the things that you've said, or do they see it as a necessary vehicle?
Well, it depends on who in the United States you're talking about. In terms of the Biden administration and most of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, no. The United States has a very long, and I would argue sordid history of viewing the Middle East through the prism of political authoritarianism, not through the prism of democracy, social protest movements that are democratic and representative. So it looks toward Mahmoud Abbas and it sort of sees another Arab dictator that's very familiar to the U.S. foreign policy establishment, not that different from other Arab dictators in the region that are supported by the West and effectively, do the bidding of the West. So from an official perspective, there isn't a recognition that, look, the Palestine Authority is part of the problem here. But I think from Palestinian activist groups in the United States, from human rights groups in the United States, from people who are, intellectually engaged with the question of Israel-Palestine and are pressing and fighting for a just solution, there's recognition there at that level that, look, the Palestine Authority is monumentally corrupt. It has long expired in terms of its legitimacy. Its legitimacy has expired a long time ago, and there needs to be some sort of new Palestinian leadership. So that's the reading of this particular problem in the United States, both at the level of the state and at the level of society.
Quite a lot has happened in the last few weeks, actually, when I think about it. There were incursions between Hamas and Israel. We saw Egypt close the border between Gaza and Egypt. So the blockade back again in full force. And I just wonder, now we've got these talks in the mix which excludes Hamas and co. How much closer are we to a two-state solution, or are we moving further and further away?
Moving further and further away. I mean, not much has changed in recent months or in recent years. Effectively, it's the status quo, and it's a status quo that strongly favors Israel. The official position of the new Israeli government under Neftali Bennett is no diplomatic negotiations with the Palestinians, no Palestinian state. Neftali Bennett opposes annexation, but he is in favor of ongoing Israeli settlement construction. In the case of the Gaza Strip, a horrific situation that I suspect will eventually erupt into some sort of conflict, as we've seen in recent years, 2009, 2012, 2014, and then recently this year, 2 million people, half of them children, effectively under blockade. 97% of the water in Gaza undrinkable, a horrific situation that's unsustainable. So this is these recent developments that we are talking about really do not change the fundamental realities on the ground between Israelis and Palestinians. The only place where there's some hope and where there's some shift is in global public opinion and increasingly in American public opinion and also among American Jewish public opinion, particularly young people. In the last, Israel-Gaza war in May, we saw major shifts, major, transformations taking place for the first time among the U.S. Democratic Party, among more dissident, courageous, progressive members of the U.S. Democratic Party in Congress. They were very outspoken, criticizing U.S. policy toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for effectively not treating Israeli and Palestinian life with equal weight and for tilting heavily in the direction of Israel. So in that sense, there has been a shift, I would argue a positive shift, but we are still a very long way away from that positive shift among American public opinion and within the American Jewish community translating itself into concrete gains for peace on the ground. That remains to be seen.
Nader Hashemi, that's where we'll leave it. Thanks very much indeed. Your thoughts and insights, greatly appreciated. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
All right, that's Nader Hashemi giving us his take on the latest development in the Middle East question. The Defense Minister in Israel, Benny Gantz, meeting with the Palestinian Authority's President, Mahmoud Abbas.